We did some trials with early feed and water system without feed and water, and you basically see that the effect is also there. So it's not only feed and water, it might also be part of it, or a lot of it, I don't know, but part of it might also be the environment that you let them hatch. And that's quite important, because if you need a system with feed and water or without feed and water, logistically speaking, that's quite a big difference.
Yeah. Well, there's maybe another adaptation. There's maybe another version that we've just invented there on where you could actually just give them a bit more space.
Should call patent agency now.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot in there, but I mean, it's definitely not a new development. As we said at the start of the discussion, I mean, there must be a fair number of hatcheries in the world operating that system already, Ron. Yeah, so.
Well, there are quite a lot. I mean, it's mainly a system that is operating in let's say, Western Europe.
Mm-hmm.
Other areas of the world are not that much into it. For a couple of reasons. I mean, if you look at a system with feed and water in the hatches, your hatcher all of a sudden becomes 5-10 times as big. Or when you just add feed and water to an existing hatchery, your density, your density goes down. So you need more hatches, you need more equipment. The other solution, of course, is not using the hatchery for it, but keep it on the broiler farm. So bring the eggs there, let them hatch on the broiler farm, which is technically very, very well possible. The technical results of hatching on the broiler farm, if you keep an eye on it and you make sure that your temperatures are there and your egg shell temperatures are still where they should be, your hatches are as good or even better as when you let them hatch in the normal hatches. But of course, 3 days in a hatcher compared to 3 days in a broiler house, it is a cost fact, because a broiler house will be more expensive than a hatcher. And if you use your broiler house for hatching, where you could also have used them for growing broilers, and let's say that you have 6-7 cycles per year, and every cycle costs you 3 days extra. That's a total of, let's say, 20 days extra that you spend, that you use your house for hatching and not for broilers. That half a cycle needs to be a return on investment. So somewhere you need to make more money on that system, because you have to compensate with half a cycle. Yeah. And that's always the question. Is that possible? Yes, no, perhaps. Depends what you find important. If you can market the product for a premium because of this, because you can use less antibiotics, or because you can have that welfare situation and you can get a premium for your product, then you are in business. Of course, if everybody does it, then...
You're right. And I mean, again, that's a practice that I'm seeing more and more, but again, in Western Europe, in terms of whole companies moving themselves across to hatching on farm in the broiler farm. So again, I guess globally, it's a small proportion of the broilers are being hatched in that fashion, but certainly in Western Europe, it's an increasing number, is the feel I get.
Yeah. Well, the point is that a lot of people that are doing it now, as long as it's a niche market, as long as only proportion of the total, you can have your eggs at 18 days being delivered on a Friday, let's say, and then on Monday morning, when you normally would start with your chicks, then you have your chicks there, because those 3 days are enough to let them hatch. But of course, that's only possible if you would normally have chicks on Monday and then eggs now on Friday, and you don't want to clean your house during the weekend. In a organization with a lot of broiler farmers that are supplied every day of the week, of course, that's a little bit difficult to organize if it's not only a niche market, but if it's total situation or total claim for, well, for the whole operation. So practically, logistically, there might be some issues that you have to consider. But technically, it's very well possible. It gives you
Yeah.
very good results, and it's interesting to see.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I mean, there's no coincidence, I guess, that these developments are in Western Europe. I suppose it's the kind of drive for this perceived welfare benefit on the, you know, on the systems. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
there's
And that
also
welfare benefit, like I said, I strongly believe in the welfare benefit of a relaxed hatchery environment, environment.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not so sure if the presence of feed and water is that much helping with the welfare as a lot of people think it is.
Yeah.
And whenever we talk about these technologies, I immediately start thinking about the data and the business processes, because compared to the like classical hatching practices, right? It's quite a big change, yeah, because you're changing completely the hatching part. You would need to think about how to pull chicks out differently, how to count, because now you have all this extra equipment out there, and then how do you count how much feed and water each of the birds consumed, to then, because you would need to move that into the total feed consumption for the broiler, right? But then if you have multiple parent flocks in one hatcher, you know, how do you then distribute that, you know, feed and water to the destination flock? And again, that there's a process change, because like you said, if you do in barn hatching, you have those extra 3 days where the eggs will be sitting there, so you then need to control the temperature differently, control the environment differently, and as you rightly said, there will be 3 extra days that you would need to allocate for your cycle. So again, this is quite a big change for overall planning procedure. Yeah.
At the same time, it also teaches us a lot about our procedures, because many people in our industry are convinced that without a high carbon dioxide level in your hatches, your birds will not hatch. Well, if you have a broad house, there's no way you can get your carbon dioxide levels up, and they still hatch very well. And that's basically because, I mean, the explanation for that is quite simple. Most machines in the industry, most hatches in the industry cannot handle a high ventilation rate, because then the local cooling of that incoming cold air and then the additional spraying to adjust the water, the relative humidity, will create local cold spots.
Yeah,
More
because they're
spring
so packed. You can't put those fans and ventilation inlets everywhere, because the machine is packed with eggs, and you have only so much space to rotate all that air.
Yeah. So it's not the carbon dioxide, it's the ventilation. And that opens also lots of possibilities if you want to create, let's say, what I sometimes call Hatcher 2.0, then these are interesting things to consider.
Okay. Yep, it certainly challenges conventional thinking. I guess that's a real positive side about all of this, is
absolutely
challenging stuff that we've developed over decades. And, you know, that is the traditional way that you hatch a chicken. And these different things are just testing our understanding of the various parameters and hopefully making us better incubation practices as well in the future.
Well, you know, the explanation that we often use for why do we do things? Well, because my father already did it. Well, as a scientist, that's not the answer that you want to hear. That's
That's true.
Yeah.
That's true.
But it's indeed, it gives you I think the big plus for all these developments is it opens our eyes for things that perhaps should be done differently or should be reconsidered, or opens up direction for new developments. And I think that's the biggest plus that we can have as an industry.
Yeah, and there are also some of the technologies that are, you know, trying to solve the problem. You know, one that is kind of popping up right now a little bit more in the in XX determination, right? Because you need to make sure that what do you do with those males, because it's not good to just destroy chicks. So that's why technology is just helping to solve the problem. But when we go back to the hatching system, is to make sure that we do things better, to have a better welfare for chicks, or have a better results in hatching, or utilize less resources, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, at this moment, when I started in incubation, which is 100 years ago almost, the biggest concern that everybody had in research was, how do we get more eggs on a cubic meter? How do we set more eggs in the same machine? How do we, and still control it? Where nowadays you see that we have, due to lots or specific people in the industry that always has been on the forefront of new developments and taking the risk and basically say, okay, I think it should be done differently. And then all of a sudden you see that once somebody thinks about it, tries it, makes the mistakes, and it all will not be perfect on the first shot, but then all of a sudden you see that the developments are coming on. For an industry, when I started in incubation, one question was how many eggs per cubic meters. The second question was how do we replace formaldehyde, and that those were the two research questions, and almost the only research questions that we had. Mm-hmm. And nowadays we see that has changed, that has developed.
Could be one of the main reasons, Ron, that people like yourself, myself, and Nick, once we start working in this industry, we get hooked. We don't get out of it, because there's so many really interesting challenges that we have to collectively look at and try and overcome. So it's quite a dynamic and fast-moving industry, isn't it? That last one that you just touched on there with Nikolai in terms of in ovosection is really interesting, but fairly recent development. And the other one, I guess, that is fairly new is in ovo feeding, which kind of follows on as a natural follow-on from the first couple of subjects we spoke about, in terms of early feeding in a hatcher and then hatching them in the barn. It's because they've got immediate access to feed and water in that situation. What about in ovo feeding? What is that kind of designed to do?
Yeah, the in ovo feeding system. So that the technique of at 18 days injecting a substrate into an egg has been developed. Well, when was it? Already 20 years ago, something like that, by in North Carolina and in Israel in a joint venture or in a collaboration with very good success. Where they found that when you do in ovo feeding, and it comes pretty precise because it's very important that you have the right osmotic value and so on, because to not disturb the embryo. So it's not just as simple as it sounds. But when they developed that, they found that the hatching results went up, and the growth of the chick after that went up, and the breast meat went up on that bird, and really having a good performance. And it's one of those things that it's almost like the early feeding story by itself. When you hear it for the first time and you don't think about it, you just see, okay, you have a better hatch, you have a better growth, you have a better performance, you have less mortality, you have less pips. So hallelujah, and let's continue and just do it like that. Until you start looking into it a little bit closer. And like I said, being a scientist, you always want to know the details behind it. And at a certain moment, I realized that, or not only me, other people as well, of course, but realized that when you looked at the raw data, they were having an improvement of hatchability of about 3-4%. Now, that's fantastic. I mean, that pays for the whole system, and you can buy a Ferrari from the leftovers. So ideal. Until you realize that when you do in ovo injection, in ovo feeding at 18 days, you should gain the 4% benefit in the last 3 days. So that means that if your hatchability goes up with 4%, it means that before that time, you should have had quite a lot of late deaths. Because if you don't have, let's say, minimum 6%, you cannot gain 4. If you only have 2 or 3, what we normally expect, then it's going to be difficult to gain 4% hatchability. And then you look a little bit closer into it, and then you realize that the people that developed it did a very, very good job as nutritionists. But the problem was they did the experiment with very old multi-stage machines that were overheating those embryos, those eggs, on a terrible way. Mm-hmm. And what happens when you overheat your eggs, the birds, and there's a lot of publication based on it, but you force that embryo to use, at the end, to use protein for energy. So it cannot utilize the yolk fat anymore, or not as efficient. And as a result, it has to use the protein from the bird. And that's why, and as we all know, if you overheat your eggs in incubation, you get smaller hearts, you get less bone development, you get less immune system. So what they did is they overheated their eggs without realizing, of course, but they overheated their eggs in that old multi-stage incubation system, injected them and put some carbohydrates and protein in that egg, and solved the problem that they created in the days before. Okay, it works, but and there's nothing negative about the system, and there's nothing negative about the researchers, because they are nutritionists and did not really understand incubation in that way. The downside of it was, and that's really a downside, people tried it in the field, did not have those problems and of overheating at the end, at least not to that extent, and then also did not see the benefit. So the research claimed, with reason, of course, that it was very beneficial, and the field couldn't find the effect not to that level because they didn't create a problem that the researchers had. And with it, the development stopped more or less. And that's a pity, because the potential of the system was there. Yep. But because everybody was disappointed, everybody said, fake, doesn't work, fake news. No, that's not the case. But there, you can, in that way, with in ovo feeding, you can perhaps steer the development of your embryo to indeed something. And just think about young breeder flocks that always have a problem with startup and always have the problem with their energy balance and their thermoregulatory balance. Yeah. Those developments could help those eggs perhaps quite well, or with other specific substances. So also there, we always have to keep in mind that, the potential is there. We just have to ask the right questions.
You need to understand.
If you don't ask the right questions.
Yeah, exactly. You need to understand what's causing what, and then you can tackle that as feeding or any type of intervention during the process, or you can go back and work on the genetics in order to improve the quality of the egg in a certain way, so that you get the right result.
Yeah, it's a whole interesting area, isn't it? And I guess it also has some lessons in there, is make sure you're actually trying to solve the right problem, and right from the outset, and not.
Yeah, that's the most important. What I always find over years, we are very good in finding the right answers to the wrong questions.
Yeah, yes, that's another way of putting it, Ron. Absolutely. Well, hey, look, I think we've had a good discussion. We've certainly covered a lot of ground, and thanks, your voice held up pretty well, so that aspect worked well. But it's been good talking to you, Ron, about some of these developments in incubation and hatchery practice. And I think we've covered a lot of ground on early feeding and what that's designed to try and improve. And then similarly, then the next kind of iteration of that is in barn hatching. And, we covered that territory. And I suppose ultimately, then the in-ovo feeding that we just touched on is a kind of extrapolation of the same thing as to how do we get our chicks started better? How do we get them off to a better start, whether that's in a hatchery environment, in a barn, or even by, enhancing their nutrition of the embryo to give them a kickstart. I'm excited by perhaps future discussions maybe on that element, because if we could focus that in-ovo feeding in the right way, there could still be quite significant gains for the industry if we perfect that technique better. And then we touched a bit on in-ovo sexing, which is huge nowadays in terms of various, certainly European countries banning the destroying male chicks in the hatchery and making sure that there's answers for that. So it's a bit of technology being used there very successfully, it would appear, to tackle that whole male chick problem. So it's been great talking to you, Ron. I really appreciate the time today with Nick and I to cover some of these discussions, and we look forward to speaking to you in the future and developing some of these lines of discussion.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Yeah, thanks, Ron, for joining. Hopefully, once we have more technologies, we'll be able to discuss them with you. Yeah.
Perfect. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks everyone for joining. And if you don't want to miss new episodes of Accelerate, subscribe and follow us on social media. We're on LinkedIn, Instagram, and Twitter, and join our Telegram channel. See you in the next episode.
Thanks, Nick. See you.
Thank
Ron.
you.
Cheers.